Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in these stories. I'm Melina, a girl who from a young age grew up in an environment of constant fights and arguments. My parents never had a good relationship with each other. I was the older child with a younger brother. I tried to shield from the tense atmosphere around us as much as I could. The relationship took a toll on my self-confidence. I always thought to myself, since there's such a big problem between my parents, I must not come from a good family, and that's probably going to affect my life in the future. After a while, their conflicts escalated to the point where neither of them had time to care for us. By the time I was about 10, when no longer received any attention from my family, my brother and I became each other's caretakers. I spent time with him, and he, as young as he was, tried to return my affection in whatever way he could. There were times when the school held meetings for parents, but I was like an orphan. My parents never had time to check my schoolwork, and this affected both my studies and my brother's. As I grew older, I tried to control things more and at least keep a closer eye on my brother so he'd be hurt less by it all. I was in my first year of high school when my parents separated. Finally, all that fighting left our house. But the separation didn't bother me as much as missing my brother did. My parents agreed that I would stay with my mother and my brother would stay with my father. We could see each other once a week, which was hard for us because we were so close together. But since I was the older sibling, I tried to stay calm and assure him that I'd always be there for him, just like before. In a way, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. Their separation allowed me to finally experience peace. I knew my parents had never been able to live well together, and I thought maybe apart, each one could be a better parent. At first, everything was better. The only difference was that my father and brother no longer lived with us. My dad left the house for me, and my mother sent her a substantial monthly amount and even gave me a separate allowance, all for my sake. After 15 years, I finally knew what it was like to sleep peacefully at night. One day after school, I saw a couple of young men coming out of our house. At first, I thought they were guests of the neighbors, but we lived in an old 3-story buildings with older resistance. So it seemed strange. When I asked my mom about that, she calmly said they were repairmen who had come to fix the washing machine. Though I hadn't seen them carrying any tools, I didn't question her explanation and went about my day. Like always, first I called my brother, who was now living with my dad at my grandmother's house. My brother was adjusting better to the situation, which helped put my mind at ease. My mother also seemed livelier than before, and it was the first time I'd seen her so happy. Once I even asked her, "Did you really have such a hard time living with Dad? Is that why you seem so happy now that he's gone?" She told me that after all these years, she finally felt like she was living for herself. A few days later, now that I was in high school, my mom started checking in on my studies. She even visited the school occasionally to see how I was doing, which boosted my confidence and made me feel important. Then, once again, I saw those 2 young men passing by our apartment. This time I asked them directly why they kept coming to our building. They repeated what my mom had said, that they were washing machine repairmen, but I pressed them further, pointing out that they weren't carrying any tools. They seemed taken aback, but they were more experienced than I was and said they were only there to check and would bring tools next time. When I entered the house, I saw my mom was changing clothes and there was a red dress on the couch. I asked her, "Are you going somewhere?" She replied that after a long time she just wanted to see if this dress from years ago still fit her or not. Then she told me she was expecting a few guests, but asked me to stay in my room until she told me otherwise. When I asked who the guests were, she said it was a few men and that she didn't want me around during their visit. I didn't ask any further questions and went to my room. A few hours passed, and I could hear their voices getting louder as they laughed and chanted. There was no work-related conversation, and I even heard some strange sounds. I started to get curious about what was going on, so I cracked the door open to get a glimpse. I saw my mom sitting among some people who seemed to be getting closer to her. I was a bit scared and surprised. I had never seen anything like that before. Even in my entire life, I hadn't seen my head act that way with my mom, let alone anyone else being so close. Out of a mix of curiosity and confusion, especially at my age, I just stood at the door watching them from a distance. Inside myself, I had this strange feeling building up, and then suddenly, one of the young men noticed me. There were 5 of them, and the one who saw me started walking toward the room without saying any word to the others. My mom caught up in the moment, didn't notice him leaving the group. As he got closer to the door, I quickly shut it, but he pushed against it and the door opened, leaving me cornered in the room. He was a young, good-looking guy. He came closer, sat beside me, and looked at me for a moment. He started to introduce himself as Kia. He reached out his hand, but I asked him to keep his distance. Under his breath, he muttered something about how my mom hadn't mentioned having such a pretty daughter and that he wouldn't come to see me instead from the start. He ignored my protest and I was left feeling trapped and vulnerable. After he finally left, I felt dizzy and weak, collapsing in tears. I don't remember much afterward until morning when I opened my eyes to see my mom beside me shaking me awake. I was cold, lying on the floor, feeling unwell and confused. Slowly, I got up with her help and sat on my bed, but she kept asking repeatedly, "Tell me that no one came into your room. Please tell me that no one saw you." Her words broke me and tears streamed down my face. I started shouting and crying, blaming her for everything. "You know what, Mom? If you'd remembered you have a daughter in this house, none of this would have happened." She looked worried and asked again what happened last night. I just pointed to the red mark on the floor. She asked why I had opened the door, which made me even angrier, feeling like she was somehow blaming me. If she hadn't let those people into the house, none of this would have happened. In my frustration, I started throwing things, breaking items around the room just to try to calm down. Finally, I pushed her out of my room and began to cry, wondering how my life would be from now on. I knew things had changed forever. The day after, I felt a bit better. I went out of my room. My mother didn't show any sign of sadness. She told me that from now on, those people would come to the house every few days. She said that these people might change and others would come in their place. Then she added, "If you want to join them, then they won't come looking for me anymore. So you either have to go to stay with your father or you must stay in your room whenever they come." I didn't say anything or argue because I felt so low that I didn't have the strength for more discussions. I could only think about the tragedy that had happened to me, and I was severely depressed, to the point where it affected my studies, and even the teachers noticed something was wrong. Until the school counselor came to talk to me, but I couldn't say anything to her, even though I felt she understood what my problem was. However, she couldn't put it into words because she knew how heavy it was. Eventually, that same counselor introduced me to a psychologist from outside and said that this person was safe and that going there would help me a lot. At first, I was reluctant, but when I saw my situation worsening every day, especially since it was close to entrance exam, I decided to go to the counselor and started therapy. I recounted all the events from my life, the fights between my parents and my mother's relationships. She prescribed me some meditation and gave me therapeutic exercises that she insisted I complete carefully. After starting those therapy sessions, I began to feel better than before. However, my mother continued her actions, which were irritating for me. I had told that doctor that my mother was still doing the same things, and I was forced to endure that same guy. However, I locked the door so that no one could come in. The therapy worked to some extent, but I eventually gave it up because I realized that as long as I lived with my mother and was constantly dealing with that guy, I would never taste peace. I decided to spend a week at my grandmother's and father's house, hoping that spending time with my brother would improve my mood. I packed my things and prepared to go to my grandmother's house, even though my mother warned me not to talk about the events that had happened to us to anyone. She said that if I caused any problems for her, we would both drown together. I told her that I was only going for some peace. During the week I was there, I managed to organize my thoughts and find ways to calm myself down. Several ideas came to my mind until I decided to retaliate against my mom for what she had done to me. My mother had never acted like a proper mother towards me, so I decided to behave like herself. After a week, when I returned home that very night, my mother had invited those boys over again, except this time I didn't say a word to her. After the boys arrived and I got myself ready in my room, I opened the door when I realized my mother had started her activities. As I stepped into the room, all the boys turned to look at me. Kia approached me first. The other boys wanted to come closer too, but Kia didn't allow it and said that he had found this girl first and now she was for him. However, the other boys weren't listening. They pushed Kia aside and he couldn't handle them anymore. My mother was sitting on the couch looking at me with anger and hatred, but I had already crossed my limit. Kia tried to separate them from me, but it was useless and he gave in too, coming close to me like the others. I tried to close my eyes and see everything differently because it was my first time and it was very difficult to me. That night, after the boys left, my mother had been pushed aside and ignored. After they were gone, she came at me yelling and started to insult me, saying I had no right to take her boys and that if I was going to act like him, I might as well go find my own people. But I wanted to make my mother angry, so that night I ignored her words. This situation happened several times until one night Kia took my number from me. Since I wasn't in my right mind and was feeling euphoric from the drinks we had, I ended up talking a lot with him. I remember that night Kia confessed his feelings to me, saying it was the first time he was at a place like that and he liked a girl. He usually went to those places just to fulfill his needs. The next day, Kia called me and said he wanted to meet me at a cafe. I agreed. He treated me with so much respect that I couldn't believe he was the same guy who had acted so aggressively with me that night. I even had plans for him. I was determined to make him fall in love with me to take my revenge. That's why I accepted his friendship request. However, Kia had one condition. He wanted me not to be with anyone else but him. I told him that I was that kind of person and if he truly loved me, he would need to be patient for a while and not set limits on me. He, being head over heels in love with me, agreed. He asked me to please be with him every night that the other boys came over. I agreed. I kept this from my mother, but it seemed she had started to notice. One night, a few boys came to our house while I was out with Kia. As I was heading home, I saw my father arriving at the same time. Out of fear, my hands and legs started to shake. I knew the state of the house and what was going on there, and my father had seen Kia next to me. He approached, and I introduced Kia as my class tutor, who was there to help me with private lessons. But my father insists that he needed to see my mother. I was forced to lie and say my mother wasn't home. My father, having left my brother alone at home, couldn't wait long, so he left and I thought he had believed my lie. We went upstairs and I changed my clothes like I always did, getting ready for the night. My mother had also met two new people and brought them home. While we were in the middle of the things, the doorbell rang. My father had the key downstairs, but the lock had been changed. I didn't even consider the possibility that my father might be behind the door. So when Kia opened the door, my father was standing in the doorway, with my brother beside him. As I was there with my mother among those strange men, I panicked. I rushed to my room. I didn't want my brother to see me in that situation. The only person that mattered to me was my brother, and I didn't want to lose his respect. I changed my clothes and could hear my father yelling from outside. All those boys had escaped. The only one left was Kia. Kia began to speak, trying to downplay my involvement, saying he intended to marry my daughter and that his intentions were serious. But my mother didn't have a response to that and just told my brother that it wasn't what he thought. That night, my father asked me to pack my things and leave the house. I refused. After seeing how persistent my father was, I finally opened my mouth and turned to Kia and my mother saying, "These two are the ones who have made my life miserable." Kia, with tears in his eyes, was silently pleading with me not to say anything and to keep this a secret as he was trying to make amends. Still, I spoke up, saying that my mother, even though she knew a young girl was living in the house, had brought a strange man home, and it was the same boy who had hurt me that night. My father's face was turning redder by the second. His rage consumed him as he confronted my mother and hit her. It was the first time I had seen my father raise his hand to her. They had always fought, but he had never been physically aggressive towards her. After that incident, my mother turned on me, saying I was the cause of her misery. From the very beginning, I was the one who had caused her husband to distance himself from her because my father preferred daughters and my mother was jealous of me. It was really hard for me to have such a mother. After that night, Kia came after me, begging for another chance because he had truly fallen in love with me. That night, I went with my father, who felt sorry for not being a good dad to me. As a child, when I looked back at the situation, I always thought my mother was the cause of the fights because of the deep love she had for my father. They had met during their youth, and my mother always wanted my father to be hers alone. But when I was born, everything changed. My father's attention was divided between my mother and me, which caused a shift in my mother's behavior. A few days after, I moved into my grandmother's house. Kia was waiting outside. He had come after us that night and even spoke to my father, who listened but didn't respond. Then, just as I was leaving the house, Kia blocked my path and proposed to me. He told me I was the first girl he had ever loved this deeply and that he was willing to do anything for me. He saw that he had quit his job and wanted to be a committed man because he had never had a serious relationship with any girl before. That day I didn't say anything because I felt Kia was just as guilty as my mother. If he hadn't pushed so hard that night, I wouldn't have had these experiences. I went back to our home to pack my things. That day was the last time I saw my mother, and the only thing I told her was that I would always carry the regret of not having a mother in my heart. I left the house and moved into my grandmother's. There, my grandmother, my brother, and my dad built a life together. Everything was calm there, even with their traditional lifestyle, but it was comforting. My only ongoing problem was Kia. I had passed the entrance exam and gotten into college. A few months had passed since those events, and I still kept up with my mother from a distance. I knew she hadn't stopped her activities, but Kia was still pursuing me. One day I saw my father talking to an older man. Kia was beside him too, and I realized that this man was his father. After they finished talking, my father came home and told me everything. He said Kia's intentions were serious, and even his father supported him. I decided to give him a chance, but made it clear that I wanted our marriage to be very simple, with no ceremonies. He agreed. Although Kia was financially well off, we rented a small house in the same neighborhood and began our life together. We started seeing a counselor due to past issues, who told us that there were negative aspects to this marriage, which we could work through with their help. At first, I didn't let Kia get close to me. I had no feelings for him, but gradually love and affection grew in my heart because of the kindness he showed me. I continued my studies, and Kia even opened a gym for me where I became a coach. I had a good life, even though my bitter past still lingered. Even after all these years, whenever I think of those old memories, I feel a strange pain in my heart. My brother has grown up and gone to the army, and I finally became a mother. Yet, even after all this time, I still miss my mother. I haven't seen her since that day, and I don't have any news about her. Until just a few months ago, I had heard that she was sick because of her past actions, but she still hadn't given them up. My father, on the other hand, had been deeply affected by the pain he endured for us. Still, I understood that life has its ups and downs, and we must always hope that fate won't play cruel tricks on us, like it did with my mother and many others ruining our lives.